Good morning, everyone. This is Laurel from the Intermountain West joint venture in Missoula, Montana. I want to welcome you to the Digging Deeper into Flood Irrigation webinar that's being hosted by the Intermountain West joint venture. As I said, I'm Laurel, the communications coordinator and staff lead for the research project that we'll be sharing with you today. Before we get into the presentation, I just want to share a few housekeeping items. In order to maintain high quality audio for this webinar, please know that you've been muted for this presentation and be aware that this entire webinar is being recorded. If you have a question during this presentation, please type it into the chat box. You'll see a little bubble that pops up at the bottom of your webinar screen that will open the chat box. So please type your questions in there. Any questions that aren't answered during the presentation, we'll address during an open question and answer period at the end of the presentation. We'll also have a few discussion questions to engage you during that final time period with us. And we'll provide a link to a brief questionnaire towards the end of this webinar, so please don't leave us too soon. And we'd really appreciate your feedback on those 4 very brief questions while the webinar is fresh in your mind. So I just want to give you a brief introduction to the project before we get into the webinar. Give you a little bit of background. Flood irrigation on private rangelands maintains many wetland systems which were historically dependent on natural flooding. Flood irrigation sustains valuable wildlife habitat on working lands, such as foraging habitat for migrating and breeding water birds, and late summer brood-rearing habitat for sage-grouse. Here in the Intermountain West, where nearly 70% of emergent wet meadow resources occur on private lands, conservation of wildlife associated with those wet meadows on private lands and agriculture are inextricably linked. While past research has explored the hydrology and ecology of flood irrigation, and we've established biological objectives for waterfowl that rely on these working wet meadows, the social science aspect of it has really lagged behind. Little has been known about ranchers' thoughts and experiences regarding flood irrigation and the factors that influence whether they'll continue to flood irrigate. So through this project, the Intermountain West joint venture and our partners sought to gain a deeper understanding of the human dimensions of this issue and how it can aid professionals in creating and adapting conservation solutions. This project was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Mountain Prairie region, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services Oregon State Office, and the Intermountain West joint venture. This was co-produced research that was made possible through the involvement of many, many local and regional conservation partners and the voluntary participation of ranchers in 2 specific landscapes in the Intermountain West, the Southern Oregon, Northeastern California, and Southwest Wyoming, Northwestern Colorado regions. This project was led by our research team from Virginia Tech and the University of Montana. And today we'll hear from 2 members of the research team, Dr. Ashley Dayer, who's the Assistant Professor of Human Dimensions, and Mary Sketch, who's a Graduate Research Assistant, both at Virginia Tech. And so now I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Dayer.
Great, thanks, Laurel, and thanks so much for all of you for joining us. We're almost at 100 people on the line today, so pretty impressive to see so much interest in human dimensions research related to habitat conservation in the West. So thanks all of you for taking the time to join us. I hope you'll have some interesting insights today that will be useful to your work in whatever way you do work related to agricultural producers or in the West. I just wanted to make a few brief introductory comments and then we'll get going on the presentation. This has been a really great project to be part of. Many of you, I recognize your names as you're coming on the line, know that I've been involved working with joint ventures for over 10 years and done most of that work related to communications and strategic communications. And it was great to take on this project with Intermountain West joint venture as I shifted from being a consultant and PhD student to becoming a professor at Virginia Tech. It's been a great opportunity to really dig into human dimensions in a way that can be really relevant to the joint venture and their partners. I think that you all will see today is a nice example of a project that's a success story of integrating social science and to have really relevant applied suggestions from it that the joint venture is already running forward with their partners to attempt to implement them. I did want to emphasize one thing that Laurel said that I think you'll see throughout today too, is this is a great example of co-production research, where we brought together conservation scientists and conservation decision makers and many folks who work on the ground. And they've all played a really critical part in these results. So while the slide here at the beginning says that this is work by myself and Mary Sketch and our colleague Alex Metcalf from University of Montana, it's really a great group effort. Folks have been involved in conceiving of the project, working on thinking about the best methods for the project, as Mary will describe, and then interpreting results and thinking about the recommendations. And then the final piece that I think has been fun about this project has also been a great example of training future generations of conservationists. So who you're going to hear from today presenting this project is Mary Sketch. She has worked tirelessly for the last couple of years on this project. It's been her master's project here at Virginia Tech. And she will take you through our study approach and the key insights and recommendations from it. So just a reminder for those of you who have joined us, you can easily throw a question into the chat pod and send it to everyone. And we will use those questions during our question and answer period at the end, or if appropriate, weave it in while we're presenting. So from here, go for it, Mary.
All right, thank you, Ashley. And don't want to reiterate too much of what Laurel said about the importance of flood irrigation and working wet meadows in this region for habitat and agricultural operations. But just want to jump right into the question of why do producers do what they do when we're looking at flood irrigation. There can be many reasons behind their decisions. It can be natural considerations such as benefits to wildlife habitat. It can be financial considerations such as the economic viability of their operation. And there can be lifestyle considerations or social considerations such as the importance of a ranching way of life. And so to explore deeper why landowners and producers were making the decisions they were related to irrigation and flood irrigation, we used the model of social ecological services to look at this, which is put forth by Hunsinger and Oviedo. The framework holistically explores the requisite human-landscape intersection, including all benefits garnered by humans and the ecosystem that are co-generated by the people and the environment. And so we combine this model with the community capitals framework of Emery and Flora to create a conceptual foundation for our research, exploring what factors agricultural landowners consider when deciding to continue or discontinue flood irrigation, and how these factors interrelate to really create this whole story of flood irrigation and agricultural and habitat viability. And so to go a bit into these frameworks, the community capital framework consists of 7 types of capital, which can be defined as really any resource that's capable of producing other resources. So I'm going to go into a bit the definition of each of these types of capital, and then you'll hear more as I go into the examples of them that we found in our research. So looking at this and looking at natural capital, it can be defined as those assets that abide in a location, including resources, amenities, and natural beauty. Financial capital, I don't know why, natural is supposed to have a little water model in there, may pop up later. Financial is the financial resources available to invest in community capacity building. Build is the infrastructure that supports the community. Cultural is the way people know the world and how to act within it, and includes the dynamics of who we know and feel comfortable with and what heritages are valued. Human are the skills and abilities of people, as well as the abilities to access outside resources and other bodies of knowledge. And then political, or social, is the connections between people and organizations, or really this social glue that makes communities happen. And then political is access to power brokers, whether it's local office members, state representatives, and whatnot. And so we looked at how these come together and impact flood irrigation, which then in result leads to working in wet meadows. So historically, the community capitals framework has really mainly looked at assets and how these resources support community development, but we're adapting it one, to look specifically at this social ecological service, specifically at flood irrigation and working wet meadows, as opposed to the larger community, although there are intersections between all of them. But we also are looking at both facilitators and constraints related to each type of capital that play into the sustainability of flood irrigation and thus working wet meadows. So we looked at facilitating factors as something that promotes or supports flood irrigation as perceived by ranchers, and then a constraining factor, which is something that may inhibit or seen as a negative to flood irrigation. And so with this model, we sought to answer two research questions. First, what components of community capital facilitate or constrain flood irrigation by ranchers? And then how do these factors, these facilitating, constraining factors, interrelate? And so to examine this, we used a qualitative research methodology, conducting 2 landowner-led workshops in the region, the Intermountain West region. The workshops are based on a model developed by Partners for Conservation for applied purposes as a participatory approach to stakeholder engagement, yet hadn't been used yet as a form of data collection. The focus in these workshops is on hearing from landowners through landowner-led panels and discussions, and really emphasizing that landowner over conservation professional piece. So although conservation professionals were present, the focus was on hearing from landowners, and conservation professionals were there to listen, and that was made clear at the outset of the workshop. So we felt that these workshops provide a unique opportunity for more nuanced, holistic data gathering, as they allow for a more informal, interactive experience than traditional qualitative methods, such as interviews or focus groups. And just a quick side note of why you're seeing pictures of trucks is we are not allowed to use pictures of the landowners from our workshops, so we thought that this was the closest we could get to that. And so we conducted our research in 2 study areas. The first workshop took place in the Southern Oregon portion of the Southern Oregon, Northeastern California region, which is a key focus area of the Intermountain West joint venture, and it's located on the Pacific Flyway and provides critical habitat for migratory waterfowl and other water birds, with much of this habitat being sustained through flood irrigation. And then our second workshop was in southwestern Wyoming, northwestern Colorado, in the Little Snake River Valley, with a geographic area extending into the Yampa River, which runs off of that. And here also agriculture is the primary land use in the region, and it's home to a large wetland complex, also largely maintained by flood irrigation. So you'll see for our workshop in Oregon, we had 12 ranchers present and 7 professionals, and then in Wyoming, 19 ranchers and 20 professionals. So to go into how the workshops were led, they were broken up into 3 different sections or sets of discussions. And so first was experiences with flood irrigation, and then second, decisions related to flood irrigation, and third, experiences with programs and policies related to flood irrigation. And they were also, both workshops were facilitated by a local facilitator. So to go into a few details of this research approach and really the full life cycle of it all, because we talked about that co-production model that's been so critical to all of this, and engaging local and regional planning partners from the beginning to all the way to the end. So as mentioned, there was a local facilitator who worked with the researchers to create the semi-structured script, and then throughout the day, checking back in with the researchers to make sure that we were covering the questions and picking up on nuances. The workshops were audio recorded and transcribed. We then coded or categorized the transcripts. This is the idea within a qualitative methodology that you're taking all the ideas that you heard from a transcript and what the landowners are saying and finding common themes and concepts, and then putting them in buckets or categories to organize the transcript. So we based the initial coding on the wider categories of social, financial, and natural considerations, and then went back and recategorized or recoded more specifically within the 7 types of capital. And then we coded as either facilitators or constraints. So you'll see it was really this iterative, long process to really make sure we are capturing what they were saying. So to go into the results, what we heard for each type of capital, to start with natural capital, both workshops revealed considerations related to all 7 types of capital. And then in looking at natural, we found ranchers were really approaching this with this landscape scale system-wide mindset in looking at their operation as they manage their land as part of this greater ecological system. And with this in mind, ranchers from both workshops communicated that they view their occupation in line with an environmental ethos. For instance, in Wyoming, a rancher said, "I consider my profession one of the first environmentalists around. We're the ones that created environmentalists." And this seemed to come into play into looking at how they make their management decisions on their land. And so looking at facilitators, there's the idea that flood irrigation really helps maintain the natural history of the landscape, especially in these areas that have been naturally flooded, is that it's maintaining that ecological integrity, as well as providing wildlife habitat. And there were appreciations of the benefits of wildlife habitat, particularly in Oregon, where it was more related to birds, and then some in Wyoming, but more related to the benefits to big game species such as elk, or game species outside of birds, so deer and elk. There was acknowledgement of the link between flood irrigation and wildlife abundance, and some ranchers really seemed to appreciate this increase in wildlife on their land. Similarly, appreciating the benefit to the land quality overall, this idea of making my grass greener, growing better grass, emerged, particularly in Wyoming. And then although the emphasis in both workshops was on these facilitators of natural capital, there were a couple of constraints mentioned, such as erosion, particularly in areas where flood irrigation was being done where natural flooding didn't happen, so you're not going with that natural history of the land. And then wildlife damage, so some areas where it was attracting birds and they were eating their forage crop, which was then having an impact. One rancher in our Wyoming workshop said, related to this benefit of maintaining the natural history of the landscape, "We're pricking fields and turning water right back to the river so that it goes on to whoever gets it below." So although management decisions weren't purely economically grounded, it was important to most of the ranchers that they meet their bottom line and maintain a financially stable operation in the long term. So analyzing the economics this way, flood irrigation really fit well within their entire operation portfolio. One rancher explained it's the most productive use of his land, and that it's also related to what several ranchers said, as in it provides better hay and forage quality because they're getting better use of the water while they have it. So it fits within their economic portfolio in several ways. And then on a slightly different note, several ranchers also saw flood irrigation as really being tried and true and a dependable form of production where it's been used for generations, they know what they're getting themselves into, and there's not a huge risk factor related to it. And then finally, conservation delivery and incentives also seem to bolster the ability of ranchers to meet the bottom line using flood irrigation by providing incentives in some areas, particularly in Oregon, where there's a program in place that provides incentives related to flood irrigation. And I'll go in a bit more into that conservation delivery piece a little later. And then looking at the constraints of financial capital, it's really this idea that flood irrigation is labor intensive and time is money, unlike some of the more recent forms of irrigation, such as sprinkler irrigation. It just takes a lot of time. So a rancher from our Wyoming workshop, going back to this tried and true idea, said, "From a strictly production point, it's pretty much tried and true. You're batting a lot of singles and you're making a solid offense. We might not make our home runs and grand slams, but we're still here." So a good sports analogy to look at irrigation there. And then related to financial capital, the rancher mindset of meeting the bottom line ties directly into build capital and how the infrastructure of flood irrigation fits into their entire portfolio. So on the one hand, the infrastructure is already there. So they're not having that capital outlay that you would with switching to, say, a sprinkler irrigation or center pivot system. The ditches have been there for generations. That said, the old infrastructure also requires a lot of maintenance and upkeep, which can be expensive and demanding. One of the ranchers in the Oregon workshop said related to this constraint, just being able to replace structures and, get the old system back up into place, same time, put in some new twists to it, if you will. It's just a pretty tough deal. And so looking at cultural capital, it was really one of the big areas that we heard was acting as a main facilitator. So while there's this economic and built capital piece, it was also really important that ranchers maintain this ranching way of life, and many saw flood irrigation as promoting this idea of lifestyle centrality, or the importance of the ranching way of life in their decisions. And so that was primarily a facilitator. of flood irrigation. One rancher from our Wyoming workshop said, "I think a lot of people just keep ranching the way they do now because that's all they know and that's what they enjoy. Most of the time, you ain't in a family ranch to get rich. It's a way of life." And then another rancher in our Oregon workshop said, and this relates more to our human capital piece, so I may come back to this. Yeah, we're gonna jump back to that. So to go into human capital was mainly were constraints related to this. There were concerns over the prosperity of agriculture and flood irrigation as relates to the future generations, having the skills and willingness to keep it going. There seems to be a downturn in skilled labor in many of these rural ranching communities. And many of the next generation are realizing how tough the lifestyle and work is, so may not keep it going. One rancher explained, to take a shovel out there and look at the situation and then make the decision there, well, I'll tell you, that's tough to train somebody to do that. And then to go back to the preemptive quote that was on there, a rancher from our Oregon workshop expressed this similar idea of the difficulty in finding a workforce. I think there's a whole set of people that are coming up into the workforce that all they've ever done is played video games to where they'd be real good with that automation, but they don't know a damn thing about a shovel or even running a piece of equipment. That's scary. It seems to me that's more and more what you run into. Nobody knows how to work. And this is particularly an issue in flood irrigation where it's really requiring that manual labor and that knowledge of how to run a flood irrigation system. So looking beyond simply the ranching community, though, to this wider community and these connections between people, there was a lot at play related to flood irrigation. Ranchers in both workshops were very cognizant of and plugged into their larger community and the community impacts on their operation, with considerations going beyond their individual operation, extending to a perspective that include the full social environmental system. And so this requisite connection with the community tended to be a facilitator when ranchers had longstanding trusting relationships with other community members or other ranchers, and these established relationships where there's this good communication flowing between them was beneficial. Also, collaboration seemed to be a benefit related to social capital, particularly between different stakeholders, ranchers, conservation professionals in the region, and other partners. And then finally, recreation and tourism particularly came up in our Oregon workshop as being a benefit. It's bringing in a lot of bird watchers, which is bringing in financial benefits, to go back to that financial capital piece, and also benefits that helps out a small community, getting that influx. However, looking at the flip side, a primary constraint related to impacts of negative relationships. So often these newer relationships, whether it's related to amenity landowners coming in or outsiders coming in who don't necessarily understand the water system and how it works and how it flows from upland systems to down system users. And similarly, misperception, particularly among outsiders, was a big issue with ranchers, where they feel there's a disconnect in what ranchers are doing and what people think they're doing. This idea that they're using their shovel to do bad things, as one rancher said. Regarding the benefits of collaboration, though, a rancher in the Wyoming workshop said, it takes honest people sitting around, getting over their biases, their agendas, and listening to one another and doing the right thing, which is also kind of touching on that misperception piece. And then finally, ranchers' considerations surrounding political capital had strong connections to the facilitators and constraints of social capital. So as mentioned earlier, related to financial capital, conservation incentives can help landowners meet their bottom line. But this also goes further into the delivery aspect. So really these relationships and how beneficial those can be, especially at this local on the ground level. One rancher said, it's the people that make the difference. And while there was discussion of conservation delivery, it wasn't as prominent in the Wyoming workshop, but that could be who's in the room, what conservation incentives are available in the different workshops. There were even differences within the Wyoming workshop between the Wyoming and Colorado constituents, so you're getting that state-by-state difference. And related to this facilitator, a rancher said, when Fish and Wildlife comes to this valley, let's go do some stuff. And so what we've been able to figure out here is partnerships work a lot better than confrontation. However, also similar to social capital, some of the constraints that we saw really related to this misperception piece and the impact that this has on regulation and policy. And there was a lot of discussion really heavily focused on water access and law, particularly in Wyoming and Colorado. And then in Oregon, there was a little more discussion of Endangered Species Act and just generally the impact of the misperception of flood irrigation, this myth of inefficiency, what one rancher called it, that's driving a lot of policy, particularly at the state and national level. So a rancher in the Oregon workshop said, I mean, sprinkler irrigation isn't the biggest threat. I mean, these regulations and stuff are a lot worse, a lot scarier. So now, to go back to the model and how the community capital framework ties into this co-production of social ecological services in all these 7 types of capital, we have to look at the interplay between the 7 types of capital. So both workshops revealed approaches to rangeland management overall, and then irrigation practices specifically that really extend beyond this closed operation. Although community capital framework separates the different types of capital, it also really emphasizes looking at the interplay between them in that they can't be completely isolated. And so with that, we saw that there's a lot of, with the nature of irrigation, there are a lot of intersecting parts of the greater whole. That is, the ecological and social elements are really inseparable as relates to ranching overall and irrigation specifically. And then looking at this system-wide mindset, ranchers often face trade-offs in managing their operation and evaluate potentially conflicting considerations and interests as relate to flood irrigation and looking at these intersections between the types of capital. So, for example, one place where several ranchers, particularly in the Oregon workshop, considered trade-offs was in balancing the natural and financial capital, such as related to wildlife damage. While they like seeing the wildlife, their damage can have a financial impact on their operation if birds are eating their hay crop. And there was also some discussion of salmonella outbreaks in their cattle from birds. So really balancing that cost-benefit analysis between those types of capital. And then the most prominent trade-off considered by ranchers in both workshops related to balancing financial and cultural capital considerations. As described related to cultural capital, lifestyle centrality is prominent among ranchers and really acts as a facilitator of flood irrigation, but at the same time having to make sure that you're meeting the bottom line of your operation, even if you're not trying to maximize profit. Survival is important. And so coming back to our original slide and model, it's important to know all these pieces play a part in flood irrigation. You can't take one and say that that's the sole reason a rancher flood irrigates. It's also important to keep in mind that the alternative, which this was something different than we expected going into it, that the alternative flood irrigation wasn't necessarily a sprinkler or center pivot. It wasn't an either or instance. And in fact, you have a lot of ranchers doing both. And maybe more, it was that this ranching lifestyle should be at the center, and that all of these considerations go into the importance of maintaining the ranching lifestyle, and then that ties into flood irrigation and working wet meadows. So in summary, the discussion is broader than we originally thought. And there's this focus on ranching viability overall. And that's where this threat is seen, is the threats and the constraints to their entire operation. And if they can't keep their operation alive, they can't keep flood irrigating. And so with that, before we go into some of the recommendations and implications of this, just want to end with kind of a caveat of the fact that we looked in 2 locations, and as we discussed, there is a really strong social ecological context at play here, which goes into why there were some differences. While there were a lot of similarities between the 2 regions, there were also some differences, usually tied to that place-based context. So it's important to note that these results aren't necessarily generalizable, but also that it leaves room for a lot of further exploration in this area and in the role of flood irrigation and ranch viability. So with that, I want to jump into some of our recommendations from these results. And these really want to emphasize, this is really where co-production played a huge role. These recommendations were co-produced. We all met for a day-long meeting in Missoula, Montana, to really hash these out. And then it was all fleshed out with many of our partners to make sure that our results were they agree with our results and that the recommendations tied in with those. So first, in looking at how this ties into the communications work of IWJB, I want to come back to that misperceptions constraint that we heard over and over in both workshops. There's really a need for telling this rancher's story and communicating the value of ranches and of flood irrigation to the communities, but also to the general public, particularly urban areas, downstream users, and any surrounding communities. And there could be multiple outlets for communicating this, both to the public, as well as policymakers, particularly those making water availability decisions. Various formats can include a story map of rancher stewardship stories, publications in diverse outlets, etc. Related to this, we also heard a fair amount of concern that water decision makers didn't value water allocation to flood irrigation as much of the general public consider it an inefficient use of water. So communicating with water districts, with policymakers, environmental organizations to help address these concerns by explaining the role of flood irrigation, both socially and ecologically. So then in looking at conservation delivery, overall we suggest more consideration of the 7 different types of facilitators and constraints into effort, particularly those that are traditionally less incorporated into conservation delivery, such as human, social, and cultural capital when considering new methods to conservation delivery. Also, considering the operation-specific nature of many rancher decisions, it could be useful to push for stronger incorporation of this so-called social ecological context and complexity into conservation delivery. Partner biologist positions could contribute to this and this on-the-ground involvement, and so we stress the importance of these positions to really connect ranchers with their place and connect these place-based components. And then finally, it's important to foster development of the next generation in agriculture. As we heard regarding that human capital piece, really that one of the main threats is continuing their operation in the next generation, finding skilled labor, and that future viability piece. So workshops on succession planning or technical assistance on the topic of ranching sustainability, connecting young or new farmers interested in finding a place to ranch with ranchers who need someone to take over their operation are options here. Programs like this could be useful for developing skill sets and training that would provide the needed skilled labor and facilitate entry into flood irrigation. And there are several programs like that right now. For instance, in Wyoming, the Nature Conservancy has partnered with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association to do a internship program with sustainable ranching. And looking at conservation programs and funding, we also think it's important to consider built capital constraints when prioritizing conservation delivery strategies. So we heard, particularly in the Oregon workshop, where there are already some programs in place that the incentives may not necessarily allow for infrastructure maintenance and are more for new, creating new infrastructure around flood irrigation. And so several ranchers were frustrated with this and there may be room to tap into this interest for cost share programs or other opportunities for maintenance and upkeep of old infrastructure. And then related to social and political capital constraints, ranchers in both workshops expressed frustration that the benefits of flood irrigation for the ecosystem were not properly recognized. In the Wyoming workshop, this fed into this discussion of payment for ecosystem services related to flood irrigation. Payment for ecosystem services schemes are incentives for landowners in exchange for providing some sort of ecological service and have been applied around the world in diverse contexts, including agricultural contexts. So thinking more about the possibility of this in these various contexts and regions. And then finally, looking at partnerships, this is a big piece of what we heard. Many of these regions the 2 regions where we held the workshops, collaboration among diverse stakeholders is already occurring, and many ranchers find this cooperation really critical to their success. They have positive relationships with agency representatives in the local office and find them important for not only conservation success, but their ranching sustainability. And so we suggest further supporting these efforts and helping as needed to ensure the success of these partnerships, finding ways to support landowners and partners in key aspects of trust building, partnership development and just sustaining these collaborative efforts. Ranchers expressed also a great deal of concern related to state-level water rights and policy, for instance, frustrated with the one-size-fits-all approach of much of the water regulations related to turn-on dates, appropriations that may not fit with their place-based needs. So going back to that social ecological complexity piece that we heard about. So it may be useful for partners to consider its role in engaging in state-level policy discussions, especially as well as strengthening partnerships with state legislators and decision makers, and communicating technical information regarding the environmental values of flood irrigation and ranching land use practices to these decision makers. And these partners may be able to help further engage and leverage resources and push for necessary local programs. And also, finally, there was discussion of just some key areas that ranchers really place trust in, such as university extension, conservation districts, and irrigation districts. So building capacity with those partners between those partners and state decision makers and other organizations. And so with that, just want to thank our many, many partners. I tried to get everyone on this slide. Hopefully I'm not missing anyone, but again, as Laurel and Ashley alluded to, it takes a village, and it was really an effort of co-production. So thank you to everyone. And with that, I think we do have plenty of time for questions, and had a couple questions that we wanted to emphasize